Malaria, Lyme disease, cholera, and West Nile virus are ecological diseases influenced by environmental factors such as water, sanitation, food, and air pollution for that aid in transmission. But then, there are other conditions that are not triggered by the environment but are aggravated by extreme weather or climatic conditions such as albinism. Welcome to West Africa Democracy Radio, broadcasting here on 94.9 FM Dakar, Senegal, and across the world on WADR.org. This is Enviroscope, WADR's environment flagship program that highlights anything and everything from climate change to agriculture, healthy environments to sustainable living, agribusiness and aquaculture, and other environmental related topics. I'm Abdullahi Hassan, your host. Allow me to welcome our listeners in Gambia, Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone to this week's edition, which is the first of a two-series production in collaboration with the Africa Albinism Network, EAN. If you are already wondering about the link between this biological condition and environment, then be sure to have the right information to prepare you for your part of the advocacy.
It's heavy discrimination and stigmatization of the condition of albinism. People have various myths about the condition, and therefore people with albinism are excluded or sidelined in various societal engagement and activities.
In this edition, we will attempt to help you better understand albinism, the challenges faced by people living with this condition, and the future in a world of saturated interests. According to statistics, there is almost 1 in 17,000 people with albinism, a rate generally higher on the African continent. As a reminder, this year's International Albinism Awareness Day was celebrated on the theme United to Make Our Voices Heard. Augustine Coley has more details in this report.
Albinism often induces two health problems: congenital and permanent. First, a visual deficiency with variable degrees and a great vulnerability to damage caused to the skin by ultraviolet rays, including skin cancer. According to the World Health Organization, 1 in 20,000 people suffers from albinism in Europe and North America. In sub-Saharan Africa, it will be twice as much. However, statistics are not very accurate. The other problem with albinism is that people affected are victims of discrimination and stigmatization due to the color of their skin. The purpose of this day is to raise awareness among the general public of the difficulties that albinos face in their daily lives and to fight against the rejection that they may sometimes experience in certain societies. The purpose of the day is also to call for donations in favor of research.
Augustine Coley filed that report. Joining us for a clinical explanation of the condition, albinism, is Dr. Folakemi Cole Adefe, consultant dermatologist and venerologist at the Lagos State University Teaching Hospital, Nigeria.
So albinism is a heterogeneous group of inherited disorders of melanin, meaning that people with albinism have a genetic defect in melanin production. Melanin is the pigment that gives us our skin color. And people with albinism have an inherent or genetic defect in the production of melanin, which prevents them from being able to produce any melanin at all, or enables them to produce an insufficient amount of melanin. And that results in the light skin color, that affects the skin, the hair, and also the eyes.
You mentioned that albinism affects the hairs, skin, and eyes. Can you be more specific as to how this condition affects the eyes?
So it's usually the medical term for albinism is actually oculocutaneous albinism. Oculo, which represents the eyes, and cutaneous, which represents the skin. So people with albinism also have a lack of pigment in their eyes, and that's one of the reasons why they also have visual impairment, because the pigments in the eyes are partly responsible for the accommodation or acceptance of light into the eyes. So where that pigment is missing, they tend to be short-sighted and have difficulty with focusing on objects that are far away. And that's one of the reasons why, they have visual defects. And also they have something we call nystagmus quite often, where the eye shakes. So that is the only other thing. Other than that, a person with albinism is completely healthy. They have normal bodily functions. They have normal intelligence, and every other thing about them is normal.
How does this condition affect those living with it? It seems as though it makes life harder for them.
Yes, indeed, because of the two problems that it comes with. The first is the visual defect. Because they have impairment in vision, they have difficulties at school. And, that can affect their performance, academic performance, and, later on in life, ability to get a good job, good means of employment, or go further in their academic studies. So the visual defect is a challenge to people with albinism, and now it's being recognized as a disability, and that's why people with albinism are now categorized under people living with a disability because of the eye defect they experience. And the second thing is because of the lack of melanin on the skin, they tend to be more susceptible to sun-induced skin damage and skin cancers. The melanin is what protects us from the sun. And when that is absent, the sun is able to penetrate into the lower layers of the skin and cause damage to the DNA of the cells there. And DNA damage usually results in skin cancers over a long period of time. So they are susceptible to sunburn and then ultimately sun-induced skin cancers. So these are the two major issues with people with albinism.
Dr. Folakemi Cole Adefe, consultant dermatologist and venerologist at the Lagos State University Teaching Hospital, Nigeria. Before we continue, let's hear testimonies from people living with albinism and the stigma they face in their countries. We head to Liberia and Nigeria.
As we all know that education is not something that is rosy, and especially wanting to aspire to the higher level is not something that is rosy. It needs time and finance and a lot of support it needs. So my education sojourn, I have not yet completed my BSc course. For one that motivated me is, for me, I'm a person who came from a family with a large background and have older people, I have younger children. And the second thing is my people, the people that I share the same color with. Most often we see when you call for a meeting, you will see one or two persons there, especially albinism, they will be like the sick. So in order for them to get a better treatment, you will have to need a pharmacist, although you have a nurse, but also on the other hand, you have to need a pharmacist who will be able to deliver the medicine to the patient or the albinism person. For person living with albinism, for the past 12 years or let's just say 8 years, at least that has reduced. Actually, people never used to mock at me, but for my colleagues and other friends on the street, and sometimes maybe when I'm walking on the street, somebody will come like that and do their hand in front of me. You can see me. And they will call all sorts of names, Jato, Moonlight, and all sorts of names. Sometimes they will say, oh, this and so person, especially albino, when they die, their body can vanish, or they can even die. So most of the time, as for me, because I'm not that talking type, so when they're saying it, I will just leave them alone. I don't have to make argument or to say anything to convince them that, oh, we can die or we can die. So I can just leave them. It is a natural thing that when you are being bullied, to feel ashamed or to cry in your little corner. It's a natural thing, actually. I used to feel bad. And my parents also, especially my mother, sometimes when I go to school, especially when I was in the elementary division, when I go to school, people put me on me. I will come and say, Mommy, I won't go to school. Let the whole school be a so I won't go to school. Sometimes I will even lie about my sight. Just because somebody bully me, I would say I don't want to go to school. You feel that you are not even supposed to be in the society. You just want to, vanish.
Because I was discriminated when I was in school. Back then in school, among my peers, I was well discriminated because I couldn't see. When I stay far from the blackboard, I have to go closer. And when I come back, my friends and my peers will be touting and bullying at me. I feel discriminated.
And most of our members can't get job because, other people feel maybe they don't see because of visual impairment or whatever, and maybe they won't be able to do the task, but that's not true. Every one of us are strong in our own capacity, and whatever task any other person can do, we can do it.
Those were testimonies from people living with albinism in Nigeria and Liberia. And now to our guest, Kwame Andrew Daklo, Advocacy Manager at the African Albinism Network. Andrew Daklo explains the key functions of his organization AAN, target, coverage area, and thematics in their actions and advocacy plan.
The African Albinism Network was established somewhere in 2021. And we've been in operation since. We had 2 years where we piloted our activities, and our pilot stage focused more on supporting countries in Africa to adopt the AU Plan of Action on Albinism in Africa. So in our pilot stage, we supported 8 countries, including Togo, Tanzania, South Africa, Uganda, Zambia, Kenya. But currently, our work has expanded to Ghana, Madagascar, Angola, and we keep receiving messages from all over Africa to give them support for them to be able to develop the National Action Plan on persons with albinism in their various countries. So our work keep expanding.
Can you tell us what this AU, charter, is said about the people living with albinism? What does it require from state authorities in making sure that people living with albinism get the necessary support?
The African Union Plan of Action to End Attacks and Other Human Rights Violations Targeting Persons with Albinism in Africa. That is the full title, and the short form is Plan of Action 2021-2031. So this is the framework developed by the AU, mandating all countries to adopt this strategy as part of the AU's own strategic framework on disability general. So the general disability framework is there, but as an specific to albinism, the AU adopted this plan of action focusing specifically on persons with albinism to ensure that countries are able to adopt their own specific plan of action that have various measures and actions to be implemented by these countries to ensure the violations that persons with albinism face are brought to their barest minimum. For example, attacks, discrimination, and other human rights violations are all outlined in this plan of action. There are 4 pillars of this plan of action. One is prevention, and then the other is protection, and then we have accountability, and then the last one is equality and non-discrimination. So all of these pillars have their own various strategic outcomes and various measures to be implemented to ensure that persons with albinism are protected, their rights are promoted, and all their needs are provided to ensure they live adequately without fear in their community. And then the attacks that are meted against them are also reduced to the barest minimum.
Can you tell us why AN chose these particular countries you mentioned? Is it because they have a higher count or number of people living with albinism?
The basic criteria was the amount of physical attacks that are meted out to persons with albinism in these countries. The number of physical attacks on persons with albinism, there is that belief that the body part of persons with albinism possess magical powers, and therefore people kill persons with albinism, hack off their arms and other body parts for ritual purposes. So the basic criteria was to be dependent on the number of attacks in these countries, and not necessarily in most cases, because some of the countries don't have much of attacks. For example, like Togo, though there are a number of attacks there, but not many. But we want to diversify to understand, apart from the attacks, what other challenges are there in those countries that don't experience much of the attacks. So we also use other criteria to understand how people with albinism are faring in countries that do not face necessarily physical attack as in the West African countries.
So what are some of these other challenges that people with albinism face? particularly in this part of the world?
The most prevalent one that many people would think of or easily remember is the physical attacks, where their body parts are believed to possess magical powers, and then they are being attacked and their body parts are being cut off for various ritual purposes. Apart from this, there is heavy discrimination and stigmatization of the condition of albinism. People have various myths about the condition, and therefore people with albinism are excluded or sidelined in various societal engagement and activities. So you will see many persons with albinism are coiled into their shell because of discrimination, and this discrimination extends as far as into various human rights, like enjoyment of their various human rights, especially in education. In the classroom, persons with albinism do not have the necessary equipment to work with because the condition comes with a low vision or varying degrees of low vision, and therefore a child in the classroom needs to have access to certain equipment or gadgets or assistive devices to be able to work with. But in most cases, our academic environment or educational system do not accommodate adequately the needs of persons with albinism in the classroom. And when it comes to the health challenges, persons with albinism, we don't have melanin in our skin. That is the condition. We don't have melanin or the protective cover or the pigmentation that protects the skin from direct sunlight or UV rays. So any little exposure to the sun or UV radiation will cause a major impact on the skin. So if you go into the sun for probably 10 minutes, you start getting burnt. And the more you're in the sun, you get burnt and again you become blistered. And the continuous exposure to the sun leads to skin cancer. And then in Africa, research has it that about up to 98% of persons with albinism die from skin cancer once you acquire that disease.
So, and Kwame, this is where the nexus is established between albinism and the environment, right? Because right now you have weather conditions, excessive heat temperature. But while we look at this, which is why we have this edition of the program and the subsequent one to look at the nexus between albinism and the environment and how stakeholders, the government and people can come together to alleviate the suffering of people living with albinism. You were talking earlier about the primary thematic areas that EAN is focused on now. Can you talk a bit about them?
Yeah, the first thematic areas is human rights defenders, and these human rights defenders talk about people with albinism who work to advocate for their rights. Then people without albinism who also support the work of people with albinism, also advocating on behalf of people with albinism in various countries. With this, we do conduct country-specific training or what we call learning forums for human rights defenders and leaders of albinism groups. We have that in Namibia. We did a learning forum in South Africa. We did learning forum in Kenya, Uganda, and all of these countries that we've been supporting, we did specific learning forums for these countries. That is one. And the second one is women impacted by albinism. So women impacted by albinism include women with albinism themselves, then women who have children with albinism. These are the two categories. So we conduct training and various interventions to support these women to be able to protect themselves from harm and also train them to be able to advocate for their own rights. We also create networks among them. Our recent activity with regards to women impacted by albinism happened in Kenya in May, where we brought about 30 women with albinism to Nairobi and trained them on various human rights interventions and also self-awareness and self-defense mechanisms so that they can be able to speak for themselves in the first place and also protect themselves. We did a survey, actually in 2022, we did a survey on albinism organizations across Africa, and we realized that it's only 16% of women who are in leadership positions. Yeah, that is about our second thematic area. And then the last thematic area, which is more related to the Enviroscope of the West African Democracy Radio, is climate change and albinism.
That was Kwame Andrew Daklo, the advocacy manager at the African Albinism Network, EAN. Join Kwame next week at the same time and on the same frequency as he talks about climate change and albinism, the very essence of this production. And with that, we've come to the end of this week's edition of Enviroscope, WADR's environment program. Follow our discussions on X, formerly Twitter, Instagram at WADR News, on Facebook, WADR English Service, and online at wadr.org. Kindly drop a message on our WhatsApp platform using +221 7818 45421. Again, +221 7818 45421. Many thanks to our listeners in the Gambia via Numi FM Banjul, in Nigeria on Albarka Radio, Bauchi State Northeast, in Ghana via Radio Pad 95.1, Damangu Savannah region, and Baft FM Sierra Leone. I am Abdullahi Hassan. Until next week, do well to take care of yourselves and the environment. I am Abdullahi Hassan.